Delhi, as well as his Vice President, National Board of Examination. Besides this, he has got multiple awards, uncountable things to mention. So, quickly, I will hand over to Dr. Amrish Vaidya, who is very senior consultant, was at Wadia Children's, and interested in pediatric urology field. So, over to you, Amrish.
Thank you, Pradnya. Dr. Vajpayee, pleasure to say the setting. That a lot should know is that Vajpayee has done such immense work in popularizing pediatric urology, in disseminating information about pediatric urology, and the publication that he used to bring out was absolutely amazing. So over to you, Dr. Vajpayee.
Thank you, Dr. Vaidya. Thank you, Pradnya. Am I audible clearly, Amrish?
Yes, you are.
It is such a great pleasure to see both of you, Amrish. Especially, I've been interacting with Pradnya even in the last CME, when it was held in Delhi. But Amrish, I'm seeing you after a long time. And hello to you and to all the audience. Hello. Let me briefly also mention here that the previous session on stone disease was remarkable, and how the Smith, Arbinder, Milind, and Abhay steered it was something very heartening. I mean, stone disease management with MIS has come a long way in children. And as Amrish mentioned, somewhere when we started 25 years ago, our Pediatric Urology Society, at that time, the instruments were not available to that extent. Now the knowledge, understanding has come such a long way. I was silently observing that how much it has dissipated all across the country. So congratulations to Pradnya for bringing such stalwarts now. The students have become stalwarts, and such enlightening discussion. I'll come to my topic, or pediatric urinary incontinence. I think you have very aptly given a very broad sort of title, which I may not be able to justify during this half an hour talk, but I will make sure that the students go back knowing exactly what they have to look for now. So, if you look at pediatric urinary incontinence causes huge morbidity in children. And it is not only morbid for the child because of the stinking all around him, the family suffers. The child's future, not only from the point of view of his social rehabilitation, but also in terms of safety of upper tracts, and also how he goes about his vocation later on, suffers. Our aim is not only to make his and family's life good, but also to see that as he grows up into an adult and elderly, he becomes independent with safe upper tracts. So you can see there are quite a few challenges. Now, there are a spectrum of conditions which are under the umbrella of this terminology of pediatric urinary incontinence. If you try to put them together into a more structured way, you can call it as a classification. So this would be like structural causes. Now, majority of these are congenital structural disorders such as ectopic ureter, exstrophy epispedias complex, a patent urachus. These are all congenital. And obviously, I won't be discussing them in detail because there have been separate talks dedicated to them. The secondary structural causes is bladder changes as a result of a primary cause, which is post-urethral valve, could be congenital urethral strictures, iatrogenic road traffic accident-related strictures, large prolapsing ureterosteels, which cause bladder dysfunction, and post-traumatic. Next, please. Now, the non-structural causes are infection and inflammation. We know dysuria can present with difficulty and incontinence. Then there's a huge group of dysfunctional voiding habits. I will use the word huge because it has become recognized for the last 2 decades. Still, it is not taken into for differential diagnosis of incontinence on a regular basis as much as it demands. So we will discuss little more on this. And neurogenic lesions, we as pediatric surgeons deal with spina bifida, aperta and occulta, and we get referred cases from those who do it may not be pediatric surgeons and not be pediatric urology trained. And then enuresis. So my focus of the talk today would be largely on dysfunctional voiding and neurogenic lesions. But also, if there is time, I'll talk about enuresis. But before I do all this, next please, we need to know about the definitions. A major stride has taken place in 2006 when reorganization of the definitions and terminology has been done. Now, urinary tract symptomatology and signs have been used mostly by adult terminologies, which led to a lot of confusion. So, the idea was to use reproducible words so that people across the globe can treat their patients according to certain headings and report their results also. So, in this way, reproducibility would help us understand the results, and cumulatively, we will understand the pathology more. So, I've lower down in this slide, if you see, there is a reference to that article in Journal of Virology. I would like to get the students hooked onto it and read it again and again because you can understand it better. In no way there are recommendations in this article. It is just how a terminology should be used. The management issues are not discussed. So don't get carried away. It is only how you use the words. So I will discuss in this talk today incontinence, various definitions and terminologies, mostly about neurogenic bladder and dysfunctional voiding. And if time permits, a few words about enuresis. You may realize that largely the incontinence in children is non-surgical. And the conditions which require surgical interventions are very few, whether fortunately or unfortunately. But the turf is common. So therefore, as pediatric surgeons, we have to be cognizant of what we are seeing in a child as an incontinent child, so that we know exactly which trajectory of treatment management we push him. And then we also know when our place comes in. And all this we'll discuss as we go by. Now, the ICCS standardization of terminology, it is defined as uncontrollable leakage of urine and is applicable after the age at which bladder control is attained. So we can't talk to a child or a toddler saying he's incontinent, the family gets flustered. It is only on a consensus basis 5 years of age. Why 5 years? Let us look at the physiological development. Next, please. So basically, what is happening is, if you look and substratify the physiological endpoints and children as they grow from infants to toddlers to children and adolescents, voiding during sleep, these episodes come down. 60% of the preterm, 25% of the 3-month-old, and 10% of 6-month-old. This is how the statistic gradually declines, and it just about disappears at the age of 6 months. Next, please. Now, the bladder function also evolves. So a young baby who's still developing the maturation reflexes, you will find that a young baby would have indiscriminate infantile voiding pattern. Intermittently, he will pass urine. If you look at him, how he's passing urine, it looked normal, but he is doing it at outburst like, and he would empty himself. But there is a residual urine. So this control comes over a period of time. First, at the striated muscle, which is the deep perineum, which is the external sphincter, and then it comes to the bladder neck area. We must remember this because we, as birth defect surgeons, come across many scenarios where we ponder, are we doing the right treatment? And where should we actually operate and where not to? We'll come to this part also. I've just sown the seed. Next, please. So the next, we are taking the, as I mentioned, stepwise maturation process. And this stepwise maturation process tells us about the voiding patterns. If you look at a very young infant, for the first 4 hours, you'll find that during the early period, in the early period of the first 3 years of age, he would be passing about 5 times during this 4 hour. But as he grows and he reaches the 3-year age, he would be passing only twice in the 2 hour. So it is a too early sort of period in which he voids, and which is what we take as normal when we try to train our children as to how frequently. For example, if we do CIC, how frequently we do it, we say we do it too early. Sometimes we go 3 early. There's nothing much wrong, but the reason behind this is the maturation of the bladder has taken place, and normal reflexes would be twice during the 4-hour period. So this is the maturation. Now, it's the storage capacity, which is by 2 years of age, it improves. The residual volume, which is higher in infants, gradually reduces. So the post-void residue in very young children is not always abnormal. Next, please. Again, we come to further understanding when we use the word incontinence. And it is important because if there is a resonance of lot of terminology when we are walking through our cases, we get flustered, and we should be confident on the turf that, well, these are things which are part and parcel of our differential diagnosis, and we should know how to choose them and rule out. For example, incontinence could be continuous or it could be intermittent. Now, intermittent incontinence can again be divided into daytime incontinence and nocturnal incontinence. Now, in ICCS, the nocturnal incontinence is actually synonymous with enuresis. So, therefore, when we say enuresis, we are actually talking about not nocturnal incontinence. Now, what is daytime incontinence? Now, this would get confusing. So, in order to further explain it, I would again refer to another classification, which was next, please, which would divide. Next slide, please. Vipul. Amrish, somebody has to, yeah, thank you so much. Now, enuresis can further be divided into monosymptomatic enuresis. I would qualify it. Monosymptomatic, that is, there is only one symptom, which is nocturnal incontinence, which is intermittent, and that is enuresis, without any lower urinary tract symptoms. Now, lower urinary tract symptoms can be only unmasked during the daytime, and that is called non-monosymptomatic. So, monosymptomatic is enuresis, non-mono is with LUT, and lower urinary tract symptoms, again, is a subgroup of clear terminologies. Now, I'll come in the next slide what LUT is, but I will tell at this point, there are patients with non-monosymptomatic enuresis with or without daytime incontinence. So you see now, there could be lower urinary tract symptoms without incontinence. And that is where we gain, as pediatric surgeon and pediatric urologist, this fine differentiation between patient presentation. This is our turf. This is our strength. And we, as students of MCH pediatric surgery, we should know at this stage of our career, what is this? And similarly, in many pediatric surgical conditions, that's where we dig deeper. Now we come to the next slide. What are LUTs, lower urinary tract symptoms? Now you see, nowhere the word of incontinence would come. Now these are increased or decreased voiding frequency, urgency, hesitancy, straining, weak stream, intermittency, holding maneuvers, feeling of incomplete emptying, post-maturation dribble, and genital or LUT pain, lower urinary tract pain. Now these are symptomatologies, and we have to ask the family about it. Sometimes we get some history from the mothers early on, but sometimes we have to ask them pointed question. Sometimes as the children grow, they can also venture into information. Now we come to the next slide. I use various terms. I use the term urgency, hesitancy. You would be pondering exactly what is the difference. Now, there are a lot of terminologies. I won't go through all of them one by one, but I'll just highlight the importance. Like, for example, urge incontinence, sudden, unexpected experience of an immediate need to void. What is overactive bladder? Urinary urgency, often associated with detrusor overactivity on systematic evaluation. Now, we are not making a clinical diagnosis alone. We are actually taking the support before we use the terminology of overactive bladder by using use of investigative modalities like urinary UDS, urodynamic studies. Now, similarly, avoiding postponement, underactive bladder, dysfunctional voiding. Now, I'll pause here. Voiding against a contracted urethral sphincter, resulting in staccato pattern on uroflowmetry. I would elaborate more detail on staccato pattern when I come to the section of discussion on dysfunctional voiding. So it's a distinct entity, and we will have few more slides only on dysfunctional voiding. So I will move further. LUT obstruction, as the name suggests, stress incontinence, leakage of urine, usually small amounts on exertion or with an increased intra-abdominal pressures. So all these terminologies are there for us to reciprocate and reproduce. Now, vaginal reflux, giggle incontinence, extraordinary daytime urinary frequency, these are all well set terminologies, well structured. When we record our findings as we come to bladder diary later on during the talk, we would have to record these verbatim. We should not merge each other so that when our data are interpreted, we can see our results. Are we treating the child in the right way or we are barking the wrong tree? Unless we have a clear terminology elicited by a great history, not recorded properly, we will be taking a wrong trajectory. So I am saying this so that you understand. I have given the reference of the article so that all of you read it several times to understand it. Now, there is a urodynamic classification of bladder dysfunction also, and that is due to the overactivity, primary bladder neck dysfunction. This functional voiding will come again and again because it overlaps many a clinical urinary incontinence, and we will understand it very soon. Now, we come to the middle of the road work that pediatric surgeons do, which is the neurogenic bladder, mostly emerging out of the treatment of children carried out. Either they are born with bad bladders because of dysplastic cords or because of poor treatment meted out to them when they come to us. And the bladder which could have been retrieved early on, they go into a worse stage. And the statistics which I'm going to give, you will realize that untreated bladders, how worse can they become, how bad they can make the upper tracts. So as I said, the causes of neurogenic bladder, the main contribution is by neurospinal dysraphism, as we see as pediatric surgeon, with a fairly high incidence. So, so we are on the right slide. Yes. Then we have tethered spinal cord, we have spinal cord injuries, we have cerebral palsy as one of the CNS abnormalities that we are cognizant with, and of late, and not necessarily late, are learning disabilities, which include attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or attention deficit disorder. So all these clinical conditions contribute to urinary incontinence, and we see them as neurogenic in nature. They may not all be as a result of an organic pathology. Most of these are as a result not only of out of spina bifida as a pathology, but also other reasons as you see them. Now, what have we learned over the years? Neurogenic bladder has been a very difficult topic once upon a time, but with improvisations in understanding of urodynamic studies and more literature coming up, better reproducibility of results and publications, we have understood now. Now, the most common abnormality of a bladder, which is abnormal due to the primary pathology of spina bifida, is detrusor sphincter dyssynergia. If left untreated, all of them will go into renal failure, 100%. So you imagine the condition which is causing potential of so much morbidity. At the same time, if treated properly, this 100% figure can reverse to 10%. And we will show that those slides also. The damage, if we see a newborn with spina bifida aperta, we operate upon the baby, the damage would start as early as first 6 months, because if we don't address it, and that's where the role of modern treatment of neurogenic bladder will come in my next slides. The pelvic floor behavior after surgery in the newborn for meningomyelocele, for example, it leads to complete paralysis initially. It's a state of spinal shock because of handling, and then gradually it improvises. So we don't recommend urodynamic studies in the first 3 months after surgery, but we do it later on. Now, deaths due to renal failure in the first year of life can be as high as almost 20%. So you can imagine, we are treating a child, we send him home, but we should send him home only after appropriate counseling and putting him on a very clear treatment protocol, which is at the next slides. Next, please. Now, what is modern management? So the objectives are preservation of renal function, quality of life so that they are dry when they go to school at 5 years, independence in old age with respect to bladder and bowel management. And that is our objectives. Next, please. So how do we identify unsafe bladders? So these are some of the MCU films where you could see various shapes of the bladders. They all belong to a category of neurogenic bladder. And these categories are, next slide, please. These are, when we classify neurogenic bladder abnormalities into those of storage of urine and those of evacuation of urine. Now, among the storage of urine, we have two components. We have a bladder which should store urine, and we have an outlet, the urethral closing mechanisms, whether it could be bladder neck or external sphincter, which should control. So storage depends not only on the capacity of the bladder, it also depends upon whether it leaks or not, and the external outlet allows it to leak or not. So therefore, we have got a subsection both at the bladder and the outlet. So we have a normal tone with outlet problem. You can have an overactive bladder. We can now move slides one after the other. Next, please. Yes, you can see high pressure system with reflux. Next, please. We can see a Christmas tree bladder. Earlier, hyperreflexic word was used, but not anymore. So then, next, please, we can see a large bladder which has no problem in storage of urine, but there is incompetent bladder neck, and there could be dysenergy also. So as a result of both, the large storage capacity has no meaning, and child would have storage disorder. So next, please. So you can see the urethral closing mechanisms because of incompetent bladder neck, incompetent external sphincter. Mostly incompetent external sphincter is when we see situation where there is a trauma, for that matter, or some kind of injuries, or even in bladder exstrophy. Next, please. Now we come to the second larger group, disorders of evacuation failure. So you see, you have a bladder, you have a capacity, you have a bladder neck, but when there is a desire, when there are social circumstances permitting, the bladder is not able to empty itself. Now, where could be the fault? Again, the fault could be at the detrusor or urethral closing mechanisms, or a combination of both. Many a times they are a combination of both, because untreated cases, they actually amalgamate into problems at both levels. Next, please. Now, the central investigation, besides history, bladder diary, etc., that we will talk about, to document the state of pathology, we have got urodynamic patterns and uroflowmetry. So urodynamic patterns can broadly be divided into three: those with areflexive bladder, which is hypotonic. Earlier they were used as lazy bladder or Hinman bladders, but now they are underactive large bladders, which will store urine, will not relieve. Child will throughout the day not pass. Obviously, if it doesn't pass urine, it gets infected and the upper tract get damaged, and it is very morbid condition. It is also very difficult to treat. So you can see flat sort of curves here, and there was a class on urodynamic study. I'm sure I will not elaborate because there are many more things which I have to address right now. Overactivity with uninhibited contractions. Now, quickly, what is uninhibited contraction urodynamic study? That is, if the height of the curve is more than 15 centimeter of water, which means there are frequent uninhibited contraction which cause incontinence. And then we have the third type, hypertonia, where the urine is getting accumulated and the bladder is being filled up under very high pressures. I'm sure in your UDS talk, you must have come across what is expected systometric capacity, what is maximum systometric capacity. In this way, we get to know that is this child has abnormal bladder, what is the grade of abnormality, what treatment we offer to him, and how do we monitor so that the stages of abnormal bladder are gradually improving. So follow-up studies give us an idea about how do we give numbers to these parameters. Now we come to Dr. Amrish, please remind me, say 5 minutes before my time is over. I hope we have still about, say, 15 minutes.
No, 5 minutes only. Maybe you can extend to 10 minutes.
Oh, that's very long. So from now, do I have 10 minutes?
Yeah, you can.
Oh. Thank you, Pradnya. So nice. Now we come to the what are the general principles? We should understand a bird's eye view. When a child comes to us, it is not the child, it is the family coming to us. The child, the most common abnormality, as I said, spina bifida, is not only spine and bladder. It is the entire, his locomotor system, his bowel management, his hydrocephalus is there to be managed, and so on. As he grows, there are other issues which come up. How does he school? Then his sexual activity, etc. And as he becomes more adult with more weight, How do we transfer him to the bed for CIC, etc.? So you imagine when we talk about general principles, we are looking at the child holistically, that we have to manage not only just the bladder, but the child and the family as a whole. So our goal are a good capacity, highly compliant detrusor muscle, with periodic and complete emptying at low pressures. So if storage is not at low pressures, constantly the upper tracts are under high pressure damage. Then there are two things which are very important. One of the major advances which have taken place in the century before last was the Lapides introduction of clean intermittent catheterization. How good is that, you will realize as we see the results of the modern treatment. Then we have pharmacotherapy. The central drug is anticholinergics, which acts on muscarinic receptors. Oxybutynin is the best choice. People have tried coltolterodine, we have tried also, but we have still found that although arguable, oxybutynin remains the best. Then we have alpha sympathomimetics, which are less used, not very good, very effective drugs, which can increase the resistance at the bladder outlet. Sometimes they are effective, sometimes they are not. But the drug which is sympatholytic, alpha sympatholytic in DSD, very useful drug, very commonly used, great results. And that is alpha-1 blockers. Prazosin, as we know. Now, I would pause here and give a tall statement. The dictum in the management of neurogenic bladder is, no child with neurogenic bladder should require bladder augmentation if we have treated him well right from the beginning. Now, we talk about augmentation in bladders because we receive patients who have been not treated as much as they should have been. So therefore, the central approach to managing neurogenic bladder is pharmacotherapy, clean intermittent catheterization. And you have to believe yourself, because you get frustrated. Families go with this prescription, they come back, say nothing is happening, you will feel frustrated. You should tell them, no, we have not been able to do it properly. So you keep emphasizing, keep calling them again and again. Gradually, there'll be a reward. They realize, yes, they are better now. Yes, they are better now. Now every time they come, I've taken another minute just to make sure that all the postgraduates take away this message. Neurogenic bladders are eminently treatable by non-surgical intervention. At least augmentation is not required. Mitrofenov may be required if we put them right in the beginning on clean intermittent catheterization, pharmacotherapy of the nature I have just mentioned about, and where necessary, antibiotic prophylaxis. Not always, but yes. Next, please. So then we see patients in the newborn period, and in our country, because of the difficult distances, the difficult referrals, even older patients come. So I'll first talk about when there is a neonatal presentation. As I mentioned earlier, there is a flaccidity followed by high pressures. Upper tracts changes start very early on. We should delay UDS for 3 months. And then we should begin therapy by CIC, oxybutynin, and antibiotic prophylaxis to begin with. Later on, with clean intermittent catheterization, antibiotic prophylaxis can also be withdrawn. Now, why is it important to start treating the child even without investigations to begin with? Because people have come out with figures that if you wait for damage to appear and then start treatment, almost 50% would have developed, up to 80% would have developed injury to the upper tract. But if you put them on prophylactically, CIC and drugs, you will find that only 10%, that also because of the complacency, not following the instructions well. So therefore, there are statistics to emphasize that prophylactic treatment of CIC and pharmacotherapy has helped, and that's modern treatment. So you can see these children are dry it is unimaginable before this introduction that the children with neurogenic bladder will be dry when they go to school, but they are dry on CIC. And we should encourage the families to talk to the teachers so that the school toilets are clean and children are encouraged to go frequently, every 2 hourly, even if they have to leave the class, the teachers should be told about it. It's very important. We see it every day in our clinics, and we should emphasize upon it. And now, what are the at-risk children? The at-risk children must be told to you in the urodynamic talk. Next, please.
Dr. Bajpai, we have a few questions to address as well. So maybe we can wind up quickly. Yeah.
Okay. So what I will do is 4 slides I will take quickly so that people understand, and there will be more questions from those slides also. Okay.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Okay. So urodynamic I'm not going to discuss. Next, please. Pharmacotherapy I have mentioned. Next, please. I told you about the Mitrofanoff principle, where we stick in our appendix to empty the bladder, and there are many variations to bladder outlet procedure. Bladder augmentation I am against unless we are forced to. Next, please. Now I come quickly to dysfunctional voiding because that is something which is as postgraduate you should learn at this stage itself. So I would come to the slide on title with next, please. Next. Keep going. Keep this one. Next, please. Next. So in my talk, all the previous matter has been discussed, overlap sentences. Dysfunctional voiding is a voiding preceded by abdominal or pelvic straining. This is less recognized, but increasingly recognized now. It is very important contributor of urinary tract morbidity. Next, please. You should all familiarize yourself, especially with the modern children who are hooked on to social media. Worse has happened during the pandemic in the last 1.5 years. Poor kids had nothing else to do. They were glued to all this, and as a result of this, they hold urine because there's a game going on or whatever. And you can see Vincent's curtsy with the girl is crossing her legs, a boy holding his urine penis, and then squatting to have his heel compressed against his perineum. So that this is how they hold urine. As a result of this, you can see what happens. The bladder pressures become high, the bladder walls become very thick, and as a result, you can see a spinning top urethra, dilated proximal posterior urethra like a spin top. You can document this in fluoroscopy. Next, please. These are the staccato voiding patterns I mentioned in my initial part, where you can document this on Euroflow. What are these patterns? It is important to document because when we institute therapy, we see their improvement. That is very rewarding to the family, to the child, to the doctors. Well, we are going ahead. So documentation and objectivization helps a lot. Next, please. This is high activity of EMG. Then bladder diary is actually nothing but regular recordings of the frequency volume charts in addition to what intake he does. And then there is a chart. Next, please. How you record it. These tables are there in our clinics, in your clinics. You should just record for the next 2 weeks what is happening. And finally, what is urotherapy? Urotherapy is non-intervention. It is simply encouragement, non-pharmacological, non-surgical. We ask families to let the child drink water, pass urine before the bedtime, and so on. So this helps a lot. Then there are biofeedback mechanisms. Then we have, this is, next please. This is the pyramid. Start with non-surgical, non-pharmacotherapy, behavioral therapy, gradually go up. So CIC comes later on in dysfunctional voiders. CIC comes first in patients who are neurogenic bladder. Now, you must know the difference. There are 2 different conditions altogether. Now, finally, enuresis is a turf of the pediatricians mostly. And
Sir, for lack of time and Pradnya, if you don't mind, should we omit enuresis because it is such a large topic and there are so many questions which I think people want Dr. Bajpai's opinion on.
Okay. So I would be very happy to end the talk here because I think I've covered.
Yes, sir. I mean, it is such an extensive topic that half an hour really doesn't do justice to it at all. And there are so many nuances to the management of neurogenic bladder. I'll just quickly run through the questions. There's one question on the post pull-through neurogenic bladders following anorectal malformation. Pradnya, do I have time to do the questions?
Maybe 1 or 2 questions you can take, important questions. Rest you can answer on the chat box.
Yeah, so Ambrish, yes.
A few questions on CIC. When should it be set? And how do you manage patients on CIC, especially those who come from faraway places? How often should catheters be changed? How expensive is it? What are the complications of CIC?
So basically, CIC, number 1 is that we should drive home to the families that CIC is the panacea. There is no panacea in the life sciences or medicine. But if we tell the family, your child would do best if we empty his bladder properly. So the first important thing is that we should encourage them to as much as positive input like this one. Secondly, about the catheters. Now, in Western affluent societies, people would throw away the catheter after using it, which we can't afford, and many countries people can't afford. So we can use catheters which are large bore for the urethra and depends upon the age. And we should keep it for longer time. We should make sure that the urine is completely emptied. We should do it every 2 hourly to begin with, and we can increase if the child is doing well to 2 to 3 hours only at the most. And antibiotics are not always required. We can boil these catheters. When it becomes very soft and you cannot put it inside, and then obviously is the time when if it doesn't work, you have to change it. Otherwise, you can keep changing, using it again and again. So in short, CIC is there to stay. They should believe in it. We should use catheters which can be boiled, like plastic catheters, like feeding tubes, even suction catheters. Use wider bores, as wide bore as possible, so that there is not much time wasted on this. It empties quickly, and it should be frequently done.
Thank you so much, sir. I think, again, there are lots of questions which have been put on the chat, which Dr. Bajpai will be happy to answer. Once again, an extremely difficult topic, a very wide topic, and you've really concised it very well in half an hour. So thank you, Dr. Bajpai.
Thank you, Pradnya. Thank you, Amrish. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, Dr. Bajpai, and thank you, Dr. Amrish. We quickly move on to next session, which is on kidney transplant. This is one area pediatric surgeons are lagging behind, and that was the aim behind putting this topic. I invite Dr. Sanjay Rao, a chairperson, to take over the session, and speaker would be Dr. Shubha. Dr. Shubha is professor and head of pediatric surgery at St. John National Academy of Health Sciences, Bangalore. Over to you, Dr. Sanjay.
Yeah, Pradnya, good morning. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me back. I think I'll let Dr. Shubha do the talking. I think just a little background. I think St. John's Medical Colleges has probably one of the oldest true pediatric nephrology and pediatric renal transplant programs. It's almost I think around 20 years old now, and there is a very rich experience which is truly experience that is true to our situation. So I think Dr. Shubha, please go ahead from here.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are, Shubha. Go ahead.
Yeah. Can I have the control on the slide, please, if it's okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
You can keep your video on.
Yeah, but I need to see my slides, ma'am. And they're not visible.
You want us to share the screen, or
You want to?
you'll have to share the screen now?
I would like to share the screen.
Yeah, we've given you the rights. You can share your screen now.
Yeah. Just give me a second, please.
Yeah.
Good morning, Kirtane madam. We are able to see you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kirtane madam. 2, 3. Unmute kar, madam. Kirtane madam. Okay.
Yeah. So are my slides visible to all of you?
Yes.
Yeah, they are. Just go to slideshow.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Sorry for that delay. I would just like to cover my topic with the objectives mainly for the information of the residents. As an overview about renal transplant, the role of surgery, which would include the pre-transplant management, something about dialysis, transplantation per se, and the follow-up. A brief on immunosuppression, and then I would finally conclude and with the challenges we would face in renal transplantation. So coming to the evolution, it is like way back from 1954 when Dr. Joseph Murray did the first renal transplant in a 23-year-old identical twins. From there on, we were progressed, wherein renal transplant came to India around 1971, which was first done by CMC Vellore. And then we are now in a state where probably even children less than 1 year are fit and are undergoing renal transplantation. Coming to the overview, we are actually, I should admit that we are unaware of the prevalence of end-stage renal disease, that is ESRD in children, which is not exactly known due to the absence of the nationwide database, and then of course the literature is sparse. But what we are aware of is this entity called the congenital anomalies of kidney and urinary tract, which we commonly called as CACUT. It is about 20 to 30% of all the anomalies which are detected on a prenatal ultrasound nowadays, and this accounts for about 30 to 60% of the cases of CKD, that is chronic kidney disease, which eventually progress on to ESRD. As of now, we know that it is about, sorry for that, India, in India, there are about obviously around 10,000 transplants being done per year, and more so in adults than in pediatrics. Now, coming to the etiological differences in adults and in pediatrics, so there is a lot of difference. Adults, of course, we know they are more of diabetics, hypertensives, and polycystic kidney disease, whereas in pediatrics, it's a wide array of etiological factors which lead the child to having a renal transplant. And what I need you all to understand is that about 30 to 40% of them, as high as 30 to 40% are urological causes, which include neurogenic bladders, posterior urethral valves, and hypodysplasia and VUR. A quick mention on this CACUT spectrum. We are all aware of posterior urethral valves or psychorectal reflux, but there are also things which we need to know is the multidysplastic kidneys, unilateral or bilateral. I mean, bilateral, of course, is not compatible, but unilateral renal agenesis and renal hypoplasias. Now, what I need the residents to know is that how do we recognize a child who is going on to chronic kidney disease? Now, CKD is defined as abnormalities of kidney function and structure which are present for more than 3 months. How do we identify this? This is now divided into 5 stages from CKD 1, stage 1 to stage 5, and stage 5 is what is end-stage renal disease which needs some kind of renal replacement therapy. Now, this is mainly based on this particular formula, that is calculation of eGFR, which is done by a modified Schwartz formula. And this includes, this is actually done by calculating as such. This is 0.41 into height in centimeters divided by serum creatinine. Now that will segregate the eGFR as to if it is more than 90 when it is supposedly normal. And if it is less than 15 is when we call it as ESRD or CKD stage 5. Now in between, I mean up to stage 3, probably we are safe. We need to follow up these children and do things appropriately and timely so as to avoid them going into CKD stage 4 and 5, because once they go beyond CKD stage 3, the progression to CKD stage 5 is inevitable. So as Sir was mentioning in his previous talk, evaluation, the role of surgery comes in evaluation of a child for renal transplant, and most of it is in terms of urological causes. I'm not even talking about the medical causes of renal failure and renal replacement therapy. Coming to the urological causes, it is mainly managing the hostile bladders, that is the lower urinary tract. And this includes things like neurogenic bladder with very high grade reflux, or maybe we have, this is just to demonstrate a child with PUV fulgurated in infancy in around 2006. And then we see that how the NCU has changed over the years till 2017-18. Probably the bladder, which is looking smaller, seems to have improved and the reflux seems to have resolved. But then we note that in the last one that it is all worse. So all this you need to document by a proper urodynamic study as to how bad this bladder is going to be. And this is going to dictate what we are going to do to this child prior to transplantation. Even European guidelines on renal transplant emphasize the need for having a very good lower urinary tract before transplant. Now, the goal, all in all, to summarize, is to have a lower urinary tract which is sterile, continent, compliant, and of adequate capacity to store urine at low pressures. So each word of this is important, and that is what we aim to do in surgery. And hence, a pre-transplant urological assessment would include a renal ultrasound to document the status of the kidneys, the degree of hydronephrosis, ureteral dilatation, and of course the bladder. This need to be supplemented with voiding cystourethrogram to document the morphology of bladder and the severity of reflux. And these two need to be again substantiated by a cystoscopy and urodynamic studies, which actually go a long way to determine which bladder needs to be treated aggressively before transplant. Now, coming to the challenges before transplant, as against other conditions, we talk about a lot of bladder management, but here the oligoanuric state itself can conceal the anatomic and the functional defects which the lower urinary tract can have, which often also we see in medical conditions. For example, there's a child with FSGS who has gone into anuria for a long time and has been on renal replacement therapy, on peritoneal dialysis, and has no urine output whatsoever, has a problem with bladder cycling. These bladders tend to become smaller and fibrotic and probably need some degree of management before transplant in order to ensure good bladder cycling and therefore make the bladder prepared to receive the urine after you have a functioning graft post-transplant. So managing a defunctionalized bladder in a child with abnormal lower urinary tract is a must. So in the end, we do come to the same things about pharmacotherapy, CIC, which again is a matter of concern because many children are reluctant, even the families are reluctant to be compliant and adherent to CIC. And of course, augmentation cystoplasty in those select few cases, so as to achieve a safe bladder and also keep the family and the child motivated to continue a lifelong bladder management, which is the key in the success of renal transplant graft. Now, coming to roll-up surgery and renal replacement therapy, of course, we are at Johns, we're involved in these hemodialysis as well, wherein we do these tunnel HT catheter insertions, and AV fistulas I'm not going to talk about because it's a topic in itself, and of course peritoneal dialysis. Coming to CAPD, insertion and maintenance, these are mainly guided by the ISPD guidelines, which is the International Society Guidelines for Pediatric Dialysis. We have a number of catheters. They're single cuff, double cuff. They could be straight catheters or they could be swan neck catheters. Here in this picture, you see a swan neck catheter being inserted. This is the outer part of the catheter, which is outside the patient. But we have a swan neck going tunneled into the abdominal wall. And finally, this enters with a cuff in the pre-peritoneal region and enters inside into the pelvis. Now, this has to be maintained. And so there are specialized trained nurses who take care of these. And they have to be meticulous in maintenance of these. Of course, when we do a particular procedure, it is sought with complications, so as are these PD catheter insertions. So we could have mechanical complications like pain or malfunction, but then what is more distressing is infections like this. I just got some representative pictures like an exit site infection, or you could have a tract infection, or you could have a cuff extrusion, all of which probably would lead you to change the mode of dialysis or the renal replacement which the child has to receive further. Also to highlight that when we have a PD catheter in situ, it hinders bladder management and more so bladder augmentation. Coming to native nephrectomy, 20 to 45% of the pediatric recipients do require native nephrectomy, either it be surgical or medical. Now the indications, I should say, have become more relative than absolute as it was in the earlier days. So any kind of intractable infections, nephrotic range proteinuria, uncontrolled hypertension, polyuria, and a special mention on polycystic kidneys, because of the size, probably you might have to do a nephrectomy so as to fit in the graft into the child. And these can either be done pre-transplant or could be done concurrently with transplantation. Now, coming to the transplantation per se, we have to be very meticulous with the donor nephrectomy because that goes a long way into what will happen in the recipient of that graft. So the donor surgeon has to be adept with nephrectomy procedures, often done laparoscopically nowadays because of better visualization, better access, and of course, better post-op recovery. What we are involved in is a meticulous and a diligent bench surgery. This has to mainly aim at getting our vascular anatomy right. We need to know the number of vessels which we encounter because often than not, we do see, unlike in adults where there is one renal artery and renal vein. I mean, I don't know, for some reason, we've been ending up having a lot of accessory vessels, either polar vessels or even vessels in the hilum. And these polar vessels may look very minuscule, but they tend to supply a large or a significant amount of renal parenchyma, say about 20 to 30% of the renal parenchyma, wherein sacrificing these may become difficult and they need to be anastomosed separately, so adding on to our anastomosis time. We also need to monitor cold and warm ischemia time. Cold ischemia is where the graft is outside and we are doing the bench and we are perfusing with cold perfusate. Warm ischemia is when after clamping in the donors and then reperfusing the same organ in the recipient. Now these times have to be maintained and adhered to. Now coming to the recipient, anatomically, what are the constraints when we do transplants in pediatric population? One is the space. So this is anybody's guess probably, that you are taking an adult organ, adult kidney going into a child. And now that we are doing smaller children more, that this becomes an issue. So many times we may not have to close all of the abdominal wall because it's often the left kidney which goes into the right iliac fossa, most often unless it's contraindicated. And we note that we may not be able to close the abdomen and we may just end up closing the skin. So much so that when we see these children in follow-up, we could actually not only palpate the graft, but you could see it from a distance. So that is one of the things, but it can be easily tackled. The most important technical aspect is having small vessels. So unlike in adults wherein the renal artery and the vein go on to the external iliac vessels or internal iliac arteries and vessels, but it is in children we need to go more proximal on an anastomosis, and more often than not we are on the iliac vessels or maybe sometimes even on the aorta and the IVC. So therefore, dissecting peri-adventitial along these vessels is an issue. A careful anastomosis goes a long way into graft function because we need to make sure that when we are doing the bench, we have this triangle of safety, what we call as from the hilum onto the ureter, where the ureteral supply, as we all know, is segmental and needs to be meticulously maintained. Otherwise, what happens is that we are going to have ischemia of the distal part of the ureter, which is going to be reimplanted into the native blood. This is about anatomical consideration, but then in children, we do have a lot of physiological constraints. To make it simple, we have to understand that the kidney receives about 20% of the blood volume in an adult, and the same kidney, when it goes to the child, does require the same amount of blood volume to go into it. And this means that the child needs to be having a higher BP maintenance and an intravascular volume so as to maintain adequate graft perfusion. And we also should understand that these children have a lot of cardiopulmonary comorbidities secondary to this CKD. For example, they have concentric left ventricular hypertrophy, cardiac failure, pulmonary edema. They're very prone for all these things. And hence, maintaining these fluid milieu is a concern which has to be better done by a very trained anesthetist and the intensivist. Also, which is very particular to children, is a prothrombotic state. Many of the children with medical renal disease have a tendency for thrombus formation. And hence, when you do a transplant, even if you have a good vascular anastomosis, these could get thrombosed. And therefore, the need for heparinization, which is commonly done at release of clamps once we have finished our anastomosis. Postoperatively, if the child is reasonably stable, probably would get extubated and not need a ventilation. But if depending on the amount of comorbidities they have, ventilation may go on for a day or two. Management of polyuria is actually a great concern. Now, polyuria, when I mean that you could understand if there is a child who is already polyuric because of renal failure, poor concentrating ability, gets a graft which functions and also produces good amount of urine. So we've had children producing about 12 to 15 liters of urine per day. And you can imagine it would be a mammoth task to maintain the input-output ratio in these children, which is probably very excellently done by our pediatric nephrology team and the intensivists. We do have periurethral catheter and stent placed, and these need to be managed carefully so as to avoid predisposition to infection. And immunosuppression is actually by the clock. I have briefly summarized all the complications in general. So we could have perinephric fluid collections. Most often these are because of lymphatic ooze. It depends on the amount of dissection we do on the vascular pedicles, and many a times these resolve completely if they are small, but sometimes we need some degree of percutaneous interventions. Vascular complications, immediate could be bleed, or it could be vascular anastomotic leaks and torrential bleeds, thrombosis, of course, and very rarely we might have a blowout, depends on how bad we've been at asepsis during surgery. Urology complications mainly are dependent on the length of the ureter, the preservation of the blood supply of the ureter, and its reimplantation. So it could lead to ischemia, stricture formation, ureteral stenosis, and therefore have a bearing on the graft function. Or in the long run, if your anastomosis reimplant is not appropriate, can result in reflux in the graft, which both of them could be to some extent or most of the extent detrimental. Coming to delayed graft function or a diminished renal function, which could happen if there is a graft hypoperfusion at surgery, and that leads to acute tubular necrosis. Even if there is a prolonged warm or cold ischemia can cause this. Of course, rejection is there in the line, and there could be drug toxicity. And something which is very specific to children is recurrence of native disease, especially these with nephrotic syndromes and genetically predisposed, and those going on to focal segmental glomerulosclerosis have recurrences in the transplanted kidney. Now, immunosuppression comes with, as we have discussed yesterday about liver transplant, mainly they are predisposed to bacterial and viral infections, and they could have lymphoproliferative disorders. Coming to follow-up, in the immediate follow-up, Doppler ultrasound, mainly to know the global perfusion and the resistive index, so as to know the integrity of the vascular anastomosis, and further on in follow-up, mainly for hydronephrosis and the status of the kidneys. Some degree of hydronephrosis in the graft is acceptable. This again depends on, because of its position, the length of the ureter, the amount of urine which is produced. A polyuric child is going to have some degree of hydronephrosis, but anything which is gross needs to be followed up with an MCU to document if there is a reflux or not, and the grade of reflux. And of course, UDS in some select cases, where we know that if we have not managed the bladder prior, we need to know what is the status of the bladder dynamics at this point in time. Immunosuppression and monitoring of serum levels of drugs is mainly necessary for avoiding toxicity, because I would come to that in brief, that these drugs do carry some degree of nephrotoxicity. All these children, when they grow up, need to be transferred and need a transition of care to adult nephrology team. A little about immunosuppressions come a long way, and we know that it is immunosuppression which has actually made us progress in transplantations to this day. So a good immunoblandulation is possible, and this could be done better without dialysis, and therefore as an encouragement for a preemptive transplant. So we would not look at children going on to dialysis and then coming for transplant, but probably we have seen that, and also even the literature records that without dialysis transplantations fare better, and this also improves the graft survival significantly. But immunosuppression comes with its own cons. One is compliance, as Sir was discussing, Dr. Sanjay was discussing yesterday, especially in adolescents, we do face a lot of problems with adherence and compliance with medications, and they just refuse to take them. And so that probably has a bearing on a delay in, in graft loss, in a chronic graft loss, a chronic failure in the function of the graft. most of the drugs like tacrolimus and cyclosporins do have degree of nephrotoxicity, and they need to be monitored. Their serum levels need to be monitored. Infection, of course, is a risk, and we have post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorders. Now, the immunosuppression regime, usually it's a very fixed regime, and what we follow at our institute is induction with basiliximab, very rarely anti-thymocyte globulin. But maintenance is mainly with steroids, mycophenolate mofetil, and tacrolimus, that is SMT, or occasionally it could be replaced with azathioprine and cyclosporin. So basiliximab and SMT is what actually we routinely follow. Now, concluding, I would say that an increasing serum creatinine, proteinuria, and hypertension, of course, a check on the bicarbonate values, which we often neglect, should raise a red flag. And these children need to be more aggressively followed up and evaluated for progression to CKD. Now, the aim is not getting every child to have a renal transplant. The aim is mainly to prevent progression to CKD and, of course, delay the onset of ESRD. Renal transplantation is the gold standard treatment for children with ESRD. What I would want to highlight is this, what I call it as palatal satiety, because when you ask these children post-transplant with a functioning graft to come back, they're very happy to tell you that they can eat everything. Many of these children are on a renal diet and with a lot of restrictions, so much so that for a child, eating the fruit which the child likes, or even drinking fruit juices or eating chips is something very great. And so that's an achievement. So coming more technically to the transplantation offers improvement in survival, growth potential, cognitive development, social adjustment, and quality of life. And it is better off than dialysis, which is both expensive and inaccessible. Now, the challenges which are faced, especially in pediatric population, is a limited access to tertiary health care and, of course, late referrals, lack of facilities for chronic dialysis in children, scarcity of trained personnel and dedicated team, lack of health insurance, lack of effective disease donor program. This is not as well established in India as is in the West, and therefore this needs to be probably more motivated and prepped up. Poor parent motivation and financial burden, which are a main concern. Now, I need to end saying that it is a multidisciplinary teamwork. I need to say that transplant should be on every child's platter, but may not be every surgeon's cup of tea. I am not saying, I'm not discouraging youngsters to come into transplant, but that needs a lot of dedication, involvement, and probably a teamwork, and all of which has to be done within the precincts of the legalities which are associated with transplant. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Doctor. It's a very, very nice, Shubha, nice presentation, very succinct, and I think very tuned to the specific audience that we have today. We are sort of about 5 minutes behind time. Can we take a couple of questions, organizers, or how do you want to leave it?
Maybe for 5 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we have any questions?
We would like to see her.
Yeah, I think Shubha, please. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am, please. I would do that.
That was request from Bharati madam.
Yeah, I think while we are doing that, I think the message here is also that at least from a personal point of view, I think as pediatric surgeons, we tend to underestimate renal function when we see our patients on follow-up. We look at the creatinine value. The creatinine value is sitting at 0.6, 0.8, and we are very happy with it. But I think in a lot of surgical patients, especially those with valves and neurogenic bladder and things like that, creatinine is a very poor marker of renal function. So I think we should get into the habit of measuring eGFR, measuring proteinuria in every patient when they come for follow-up. I think it is extremely important, and growth and development. I think that's one point that I want to make while Shubha is putting on her camera.
I'm seen, sir, I hope.
No, I not on my screen at least. Yeah.
Yes, we are able to see.
My video is on and I've stopped sharing my screen. So can you all see me?
Yes.
Yes, we can see. Yeah. The other point that I would like to make is that the kidney, any transplanted organ has a shelf life, and the shelf life for a kidney is on an average 13 years. So in theory, most children, when they are transplanted in the first decade or second decade, will require a second or third transplant during their lifetime. So I think it is very important as pediatric surgeons to make sure that we delay the transplantation by preserving whatever last nephron function that we have in our patients. I think it is extremely important. But when transplantation is required, I think we should go at it aggressively rather than trying to delay with various other things. I think those are two messages that I wanted to leave. I think there are some questions coming on the chat box.
Yes.
Shubha, would you like to?
Yeah, as we talked about liver transplant, the transplantation success is mainly assessed in terms of graft survival and overall survival. So as Sir said, graft survival, for example, a 60-year-old or a 50-year-old undergoing transplant and having the kidney function for another 15 years means is whole lifetime. But in a child, probably it is not so. Having said that, we do have children who are like sort of now married and into good jobs and having kids as well. So their graft function is lasted. They were the ones who were transplanted way back in 1999, 2000, and they're like 10 to 12 years now, and they seem to be doing well. But as Sir said, what we are looking at, even in spite of children being or families being compliant with immunosuppression and taking good care of everything and being compliant with CIC, still the chronic graft loss is a concern, and therefore need for another transplant. And also emphasis has to be on a good compliance with both medication and CIC, which most of these people end up with.
There is a question from Dr. Ramesh Babu. What is the role of preemptive transplant? That's the first question he is asking. And the second is, what is the youngest age that has been done in your team?
Yes, so I think the emphasis is more and more on preemptive transplants because we've seen children, especially hemodialysis, of course, is not accessible to every child and every center because all the centers don't have the facilities. But then CAPD is what everybody does it and the families do it, they're trained to do it. But then when we have a child on PD, we know that they develop a lot of comorbidities, and maintaining this PD itself for a long time has a bearing on growth, which does not improve even if you do a transplant at a later date. More than that, also the comorbidities, the cardiac, the pulmonary, maintaining dry weight, especially what we talk about dry weight in children on dialysis. Maintaining that itself is difficult, and any variations in these fluid shifts mean a lot to that particular kid. And hence, there is more and more emphasis on preemptive transplant. So when you have a child who's don't have to be totally symptomatic, because in strict terms, CKD, ESRD means less than 15 ml per minute of eGFR with symptoms of uremia, malnutrition, and growth failure. Even you don't have to wait for that, but if you can prepare them for a transplant without any other modes of renal replacement is advisable. That is one thing. Second one is how early we have done. I should say, rather than saying the age, I think it's the weight that matters. We have done children who are 10 kgs because even you could have an 8-year-old who is just about 10 kgs. So 10 kgs is the least weight which we have done in our institute, and the child is doing well. Thanks.
Thank you. Both the faculties and Sanjay, with one comment from you, we will close the session and move on to next if you want to make any comment.
Yeah, I think again, like I mentioned yesterday, I think renal transplantation is something that we as pediatric surgeons must get into. I think technically it is not a very challenging thing. The skills are easily learned, and the number of people, it is something that we can really add, and it is a stepping stone into transplantation as a specialty for us as pediatric surgeons. So I think I sort of urge all the younger pediatric surgeons out there, to explore these fields and try and get trained and get involved with these activities, because you really make a difference, both in terms of the help you give your patients and also upping the profile of your own programs. It is a bit like Formula One racing. The techniques and technology that you learn while doing transplantation really improves and lifts the whole, pediatric surgical skill set and environment that you work in. So I would seriously urge everybody to, at least in their departments, consider trying to establish this, of course, along with your adult colleagues, and, try to work in a working relationship. I think it is something we should explore. With that, thank you, Pradnya.
Thank you so much, both the faculties, and that was the sole purpose of putting this topic in the CME, encouraging juniors and younger generation. With that, we move on to next session, which is also very, very important for urologists, pediatric urologists. The topic is radionuclide scans in urology. Speaker is Dr. Anand Alladi and chairperson is Dr. Sujit Chaudhary. Over to Dr. Sujit.
Thank you, Pradya. Privileged to be a part of this program. And I welcome Anand to start his teaching session on radionuclide medicine and its applications in different conditions that we deal with.
Yeah.
Anand, are you there?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, very much. Thank you. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. Just give me a minute because I'm just sharing this thing.
Till he starts, for sake of audience, introduction of Dr. Alladi. He is professor and head of Department of Pediatric Surgery, Bangalore Medical College. And Dr. Sujit Chaudhary is head of Pediatric Urology at Indraprastha Apollo Hospitals, Delhi.
Are you able to see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay. Just a second. I think there's some problem with that.
Dr. Sujit, you can start with some introduction till we start the.
So, isotope studies in the evaluation of urological conditions and in the post-operative assessment had its origin 3 to 4 decades ago, and the fundamental application came out of post-transplant assessment and not for the assessment of urological conditions. But the fact that it avoided radiation in children allowed it to be used for many extensions in urological practice. So I think Anand will be dwelling on all this in great detail, that while it is an extremely sensitive and reliable investigative tool for evaluating obstruction, for evaluating progression of scars in the kidney.
Sorry, I had to. It keeps saying host has disabled from screen share.
Anand, are you all right?
I am, but it repeatedly keeps saying host has disabled the attendee from screen sharing.
Okay.
Okay. So it's something to do with the hosts.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So basically, I think as this thing is getting set up,
Yeah.
Nuclear medicine is something which is very essential for our pediatric urology practice, and we do have very few centers where you will have ready access to the nuclear medicine department. Most of the time we end up 1 second, I think there's still some problem with the sharing.
No, I think we can see your screen, Anand.
Your screen, yeah.
We are
Okay,
able
so
to see your screen. Yeah.
Is it down, seen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, fine. Yeah, so as I was saying that we have issues with the availability of the department in-house. Most of the time in practice, we end up being sent a report from a nuclear medicine center, and most of these nuclear medicine centers are those who are more into PET scans and oncology and also do pediatric urology, by the way. So it is good to have some basic knowledge of this, how to interpret, and preferably have a good rapport with the nuclear physicist so that initial days all the reports are discussed with and then come to a common consensus. Now coming to the indications where we use nuclear medicine in pediatric urology, and I think there was a talk yesterday or day before on the principles of nuclear medicine. Just to summarize, nuclear medicine uses basically a radiopharmaceutical, which is a tagged radioisotope, which emits gamma radiations which are picked up by the gamma camera. And this is tagged to a isotope. This is tagged to a pharmaceutical, which is, depending on the organ involved, is specifically handled by that organ. And tracking the radiation, it is either then it generates the static picture which gives you some idea of the anatomy, or you can follow the activity over a period of time and get some idea of either the function or the course of the radioisotope, either as a drainage or as a excretory parameter. So basically, we are looking at functional and anatomical imaging. And when you come to pediatric urology, the radioisotope used is usually technetium-99. And the radiopharmaceutical, which is the pharmaceutical which is tagged to the radioisotope, are broadly grouped into three categories. Those which are basically handled by gamma filtration, that is DTPA, which is more or less now specifically used only in post-transplant evaluation. The one which we are generally requiring to analyze, use and interpret and make decisions on whether to operate or not are for the obstructive pathologies, and the pharmaceutical used here are basically tubular agents. The ones which we have available are the more expensive MAC3, mercaptostyle triglycine, or ethyl dicysteine, EC to be short. The third category of pharmaceutical which is used is the dimercaptosuccinic acid, which is basically taken up and held by the cortex for few hours and gives us static images about the structure, maybe abnormal positioning, abnormal types of development, and any scarring or sequelae of infections.
Yeah.
So when we go through the evaluation and how to interpret indications, we have already more or less very familiar with. Basically, when we look at differentiating a dilated system from that due to obstruction, which may end up requiring surgery, and that due to just a dilated system not having obstruction requiring follow-up, it is the most important indication for a diuretic renogram. And the situations where we come across these are hydronephrosis, most commonly antenatally detected hydronephrosis, sometimes ureteronephrosis, where the initial micturating cystourethrogram rules out reflux, and we are looking at whether there is a primary megaureter or an obstructive megaureter. And of course, a few of the other situations where we need further information, like in a ureterocele, where we want to rule out obstruction in a duplex system, where we are not sure about upper moiety being obstructed or not, etc. So before we actually go on to the procedure, there are certain questions which come up from parents, anxious parents. The first thing, the moment you say radiation or radionuclide scan, is the concern of radiation. However, as many times have been discussed, especially when we talk about cystourethograms, that the diuretic radionuclide cystogram versus conventional MCU, that the radiation exposure by the various radionuclide scans are very, very low compared to conventional radiation produced by either X-rays or CT scans. And just to compare, an isotope renogram, what a patient is subjected to, gives radiation which is almost less than 5% of the safe allowable radiation to healthcare workers who are regularly working in radiology departments. And also the natural background environmental radiation, especially in certain states of India, is found to be definitely much more than any of these tests which the babies are subjected to. Having gone from that, when the child is actually being taken up for the radiation, for the radioisotope scan, there are certain things which we need to keep in mind, and we have to interpret the final result. Most important of it being hydration. We will talk about these in detail as we go down the slide. Sedation, whether to use it or not, when to use a diuretic in a diuretic renogram, whether to drain the bladder or not, and what are the types of agents to be used in specific situation. Once this has been overcome and we go ahead with the test with an appropriate hydration, proper recording of various parameters, and finally, once the computer accessed or acquired all the data which is required, then comes the actual sitting in front of the computer and generating the curves, graphs, and the report. And here again, there are certain things which we need to keep in mind which can influence the result. Drawing the region of interest, where to use the background subtraction on the body, whether there are movement artifacts or whether actually biphasic curves which are coming up due to other associated pathologies, how to calculate differential function, what are the problems in calculating differential function by using the computer software, and if it is possible, as such as possible, to eliminate these artifacts to get a sensible report. So coming to the first group of patients, the commonest being hydronephrosis, where we want to look at whether there is an obstructive hydronephrosis or not. The diuretic renogram which we use, generally we confine ourselves to the tubular agents nowadays. ECE is of course more less expensive compared to MAC3. DTPA, as I said before, is used mainly for post-transplant evaluation. When we are coming to the diuretic renogram, once the child has been prepared and the child has got a good IV access, very important to have a good pediatric nurse or somebody who can get an IV access, and people who are not very familiar or doing less number of children and do nuclear scans one-off may require the IV cannula to be inserted before the child is sent to the scan. And once the radioisotope is injected, after the hydration and all have been taken care of, initially there are the graph, the final report which comes up will have basically two series of images. The first one are the initial few seconds for the first 1 minute, which are taken every 1 to 2 seconds. And the same thing is interpreted as a graph. The graphs which are usually generated are called time activity curve, where the time is on the x-axis and the activity, radioactivity generated from the region of interest on which the gamma camera is focused gives you the radioactivity. And the graphs, the pictures which are taken initially are the perfusion images. This is for every 1 or 2 seconds for the first 1 minute, and subsequently the images for drainage and clearance, that is every 1 or 2 minutes for the next 30 minutes. So you will have two series of images. Corresponding to them, you will have two time activity curves. We will have a static picture which shows how the region of interest or where the region of interest has been drawn. Then we will have certain calculations which are put up, which gives the uptake, converting it into percentage, either the GFR if the DTP is used, or the effective renal plasma flow if the tubular agents are used, the differential function, and we have subsequent static images which are taken. If catheter has been used, then generally we will have a early static and a delayed picture. If catheters are not used, we may have an additional graph, a little picture here, which is your post-void film in addition to the immediate static, a post-void and a delayed picture. So these are all the components which we will be looking at when we are analyzing the isotope scan. So in the initial frames, what we will be looking at is when the activity has started arriving in the kidney, whether they all come at the same time or at different time, and if there is gross difference between the time of activity appearing in the picture in one of the other kidneys, which generally itself will tell you that there is some amount of poor perfusion or uptake by that kidney. So you start off analyzing that. At that point, it tells you, looking at this graph, it is almost similar. I mean, it's very obvious to everybody that it is almost same amount of intensity. These pictures can also be generated at colored pictures. I mean, it's just sitting on the computer and changing the thing. So you can have color pictures like this. You can have black and white pictures. You have different colors to put more hot being darker or different colors. So it's very obvious here that more or less the function, the uptake and the perfusion is almost same. The same thing is depicted in the graph. You have one region of interest over the aorta, which shows the runoff. And at this point, it might be also important for us to make sure that if the aortic curve sometimes starts off low and start going up in a blunted way, and there's no acute washout from the aorta coming to almost the same level as the kidneys where the uptake has been maximized, there might be a reason for you to look at the IV axis area to see if there is extravasation and the isotope has not reached the circulation properly. Then the whole test is to be abandoned and done another day. So aortic washout reaching a lowest ebb at the time where the renal pickup almost reaches the peak tells you that this is more or less a proper initial perfusion phases which have been recorded. Subsequently, we go on to the region of interest drawn and see how the kidney, again here we have we'll look at other parameters, but just to understand that how much the activity were there in both the kidneys, whether the intensity were the same and how fast they disappeared and became lighter and lighter and completely drained out. The same thing again is put as a time activity curve. which has components, the initial upstroke, which generally shows how fast it got excreted out, especially when we are using the furosemide, depending on whether it's an F0 or an F-15 protocol or an F+20 protocol, the slope of this curve may vary. But how much it varies, it will always be a rapid upstroke and then reaches a plateau. Then the drainage starts. Again, the drainage may be rapid, coming down and then slowly tapering off, or very slowly coming down, or an upgoing slope. The curve, the type of the curve will also tell us what is the situation we are dealing with. Once the initial 30 minutes frames are obtained, then they look at taking immediate static films, which tells us how the activity is there at the end of the 30-minute study, whether both are equal, whether one is completely drained. And after this, if in this situation there's no catheter, if there's no drainage, then you have to generally have a post-void. What happens in most of the infants is that the child is carried around, held vertically, moved around for 4 to 5 minutes, and then they're taken back into the console and activity recorded. That usually it would have avoided, and also gravity-aided drainage would have taken place. And then subsequently, if it is persisting to show activity, a delayed frame is taken after 2 hours or so. The differential function, others will pick up. I'll just come to that later. So sometimes we may have in the curve biphasic curves. Now you may have a gradual biphasic curve like this, which can also mean that the effect of the diuresis is coming up, or the bladder is not empty, or the child is just started to void and the initial bladder pressure has gone up. Or you may have a gross movement artifact like this. When you see these sort of picture, it is very essential to look at the cine and see whether these are movement artifacts or they're actually biphasic curves, which can happen in very full bladder with a VUJ obstruction, or the region of interest put on the lower mid-ureter, or if there is a reflux. And this is a situation where you have a pre-void and a post-void, immediate and subsequently a delayed picture. If you have an opportunity, it is always good to go and sit in front of the console, look at the cine. This gives us a very good picture about how it's happening, and it gives a bullseye view, eyeball view of the whole situation, how fast it's appearing and clearing. The other advantage of this is that you can easily make out if there is gross movement artifact, because as the cine is going on, the kidney will keep moving up and down due to the movement of the baby. And this sort of picture would require frame by frame correction on the computer before we are able to generate a report and analyze the films. So the initial point, what we were discussing is about the hydration. What is the importance of hydration? If the hydration is poor, it can, especially in gross hydronephrosis, interfere with the interpretation and give us wrong or abnormal value with respect to both the differential function and the clearance, and give us a false obstructive parameter instead of a situation where it's just a non-obstructive hydronephrosis. So what are the effects of poor hydration? You can see that a typical upslope should be rapidly upgoing and then come down immediately and then gradually taper off. However, if the hydration is poor, you can see, and especially it affects both the kidneys. If this same picture is seen only in one kidney and the other kidney is like this, it's more likely to be a pathological kidney. On the other hand, if both the kidneys are showing the same pattern, a slow upstroke, time taken to go up, slower clearance, and increased slope of excision. Of course, this also you'll need to look at the picture. It is like putting this graph and then trying to compress this, and obviously the picture will change. But when you look at it on the system and look at both the graph, definitely you will be able to make out that there is some amount of slower transit. The other way of looking at it is when the bladder activity starts appearing in those children who are not catheterized, or even if they are catheterized, sometimes there will be always some amount of residual urine in the bladder. Appearance of the bladder activity early, within the first 6 to 8 minutes, implies good hydration. If it doesn't appear for a significantly long amount of time and the child is still not catheterized, one should always look at the hydration status. In those who are catheterized and activity is not seen in the bladder, it's always good to look at initial frames and see at what point of time the activity is appearing in the pelvis from the kidney. Within the first 2 to 3 frames, the activity should have appeared in the pelvis for us to accept good hydration. So these are small things which we look at to make sure that there is good hydration. So this is again a picture where when the hydration is taken care of, this is a catheterized sample, and you can see looking at the curves that the upslope is rapid and even the downslope is quick enough. The second thing is bladder drainage. There are the initial well-tempered renogram, which are recommended by the Society of Nuclear Medicine, always insisted on bladder catheterization. However, with all the other disadvantages, discomfort of the baby, causing more movement artifact, there is a possibility of carrying out the study without bladder catheterization, unless we are actually looking at areas of VUG obstruction or reflux or some other lower urinary tract pathology where we are using the isotope scan for. What we would then need to do, make sure is, after the study is completed, make sure that the child is held up, carried around, and have an immediate post-void film, and then subsequently the delayed film. You can see in this that the drainage is significantly lower compared to the immediate post-void, and the activity significantly decreases after the bladder has emptied, at least partially. And this is a situation where the bladder is empty, so it clears up quite rapidly. Now, coming to the differential function. Differential function is there are various ways of calculating the differential function, but whichever way we use, whether it is a camera generated, whether it is the plot, RP plot which is used, it is always built into the computer software. And there are certain factors which influence that. The region of interest which is drawn for calculating the differential function, putting a region of interest on the parenchyma rather than the whole kidney is always better when you are calculating differential function. Whereas when you are looking at drainage, then the region of interest is drawn or the pelvic calyceal system that almost includes the whole kidney. The computer usually is programmed to calculate the differential function, summing up all the images at the first one and between the first and second minute of the study, or the second and third minute of the study, depending on whether glomerular agents or tubular agents are used. The disadvantage of using this, we will see a little later, are that in some situations when there is very rapid clearance, and the computer is programmed to take the reading at second and third minutes, the normal functioning kidney is already cleared out completely, and when at that point of recording, it will show very little activity and give a erroneous hyperfunction of the affected kidney. So these are things which we need to keep in mind when we analyze the PIC films of the differential function which has been generated by the computer. Now, looking at the various parameters, there may be differential function, there may be time activity curves, there may be t-halves, there may be normalized residual activity, there are output efficiency. There are lots of parameters over a period of years which have been thought of, looked at, given up, continue to be used. But finally, what it boils down to is something which you are commonly using. Stick to that. Make sure the nuclear physicist is on board with you and use parameters which can be repeated and give you the same information if you check it on the system again and again. Just to show how many parameters have come and gone, there are almost 60 parameters which are computer generated, including cortical transit time and other transit time. There are other 56 parameters which are subsequently added. Almost 110 parameters have been added. But each of these finally are influenced by how you do the test, what are the precautions you take, and then how you interpret it. T-half used to be one of the standard parameters which used to be used earlier, saying more than 20 is always obstructive, less than 10 is always non-obstructive. But that again is influenced by hydration, the agent, whether it's glomerular or tubular agent, the dose and timing of the diuretic used, the catheter presence or absence of catheters, and other parameters. Some of the parameters which I've used are the output efficiency. Basically, it looks at the maximum activity taken up by the kidney and how much of that is remaining in the kidney at fixed point of time. So it can be at the end of the drainage, it can be at the end of the voiding of the, or it can be at the end of the delayed picture. But basically, it's a ratio which tells you how much of activity is remaining in the kidney. The other parameter which was looked at is the normalized residual activity. Again, the amount of activity retained in the pelvic system at a point T. If this is done as a post-void or as a delayed image, this has definitely found to have some relevance, but the same thing can be looked at on the picture and you can get a rough idea as to whether there is actually significant residual activity or not. Many centers, even the European Union, have started using this and giving fixed percentages, saying persistence of 60% at 1 hour, 40% at 2 hours, and various parameters, but they've still not been standardized and come to regular use. GFR usually is used when the glomerular agent like DTP is used. when they use the computer camera generated GFRs, it's not going to be very accurate in the children, the Gates method, more appropriate in use in adults. The ideal way to use is plasma sampling, where they look at different the plasma levels of the count at different points of time. But this again would require multiple sampling, so not very much in vogue. And the same information equivalent of the GFR, but a little smaller percentage, can be obtained by effective renal plasma flow, which is the calculation of the same by using the parameters in MAC3 and EC scans. It is always useful to look at the post-void frames, which I said in the beginning, and also the post-void activity to the maximum activity, which is again something the normalized residual activity talks about. We need to develop this in our respective labs and standardize that, and you can always use that as a parameter to interpret the report till standard parameters come into vogue. Now, just a few pictures to show how changing the regions of interest can change the reporting. Now, this is a same patient, the left kidney, where the activity, the region of interest has been put only on the renal parenchyma versus the whole kidney, and the differential function promptly changes from 41% to 53%, 57%. So it is very important to know how to interpret that and look at all the frames and see whether it has been appropriately used, especially when you're using the differential function and the agent used. This is another example where the background activity changes. How we put the background activity region of interest changes the interpretation. This is where the background activity is put in the perinephric region and in the infralateral aspect. The differential function, as you can see, again changes. Using this is ideally recommended to put it in infralateral aspect. Again, the background subtraction areas region of interest should be carefully put when we are analyzing ectopic kidneys. Few examples of how tubular agents.
Kind of 5 minutes more, maybe.
Yeah. So few examples of how DTPA versus EC changed the parameters. The same patients, when the DTP was done and subsequently an EC 2 days later, the type of curves changed. The obstructive becomes non-obstructive. The differential function also changes. The early clearance versus the delayed clearance also changes. Differential function. So these are all examples of how these can change. So some examples of patients where you have a classic PUJ obstruction with function compromised. The same thing you can see in a delayed picture. Same thing would appear in a cine. Going on to a patient where the function apparently looks preserved, which might be because of a hyperperfusion. But if you look at the delayed picture, there is no doubt that this is an obstructed parameter. So also in the cine. Non-obstructive parameters, again, it's good to look at the cine. I will just skip these slides. Hyperfunction we already talked about. There are certain reasons, like I said, wrong region of interest using tubular agent with later calculation. Occasionally we do get a factual hyperfunction that could be due to subnormal contralateral function or compensatory hypertrophy. The VUJ obstruction is another situation where we can look at prime activity curves, putting the region of interest on the VUJ windows and looking at the videos. This is two of them. The right side is clearing up. The activity will always show biphasic because there is peristaltic activity taking place, but the left side is showing a significant obstruction with upgoing slopes. And the same thing can be looked at on the cine, which shows persistent activity, nothing coming into the bladder. And this is some situation where you would have put in another thing. Another artifact where you would see was in the initial films, I'll be reported almost a non-functional kidney, but in the delayed picture, there'll be some activity coming up because this is extremely slow excretion in a very densely dilated and redundant system. So instead of calling this a non-functioning or a poorly functioning kidney and thinking of whether we should be looking at an nephrectomy or not doing anything, these would be kidneys which could be still salvaged in those situations. So just a few pictures about where we use DMSA. One point we would like to stress on DMSA is that most of the time there is a debate about when to do the DMSA after the infection. What has been found and which has been the basis of the top-down approach is that if initial DMSA does not show any pyelonephritic changes or scar after a UTI, it's extremely unlikely that subsequent UTIs will show any scarring. So that is one. Second, there are a lot of follow-up studies where even up to 3 years, they continue to show improvement in the pyelonephritic focus, and they could not call it scar in spite of following them up to 4 years. So there is no specific time frame to say that if it persists beyond a particular time, that is scar, and if it is seen before that, it is pyelonephritic changes. DMSA's utilization in specific situation like non-functioning kidney, duplex system with differential function, horseshoe kidney, etc. And again, reflux is another situation where nuclear medicine is used. We have standard gradings now as grade 1, 2, and 3, which corresponds to the non-dilating and severe reflux of the MCU. So I think I'll stop that here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Maybe we can close this session with comment from Dr. Sujit Chaudhary. And
Thank you, Anand, for a very exhaustive and a complete session on radionuclide scan. Rather than go into comments from me, let us see if we have any questions from the audience, and let's deal with the audience related questions first.
maybe we can take those questions in chat box and answer there only, because we are running pretty late. But if you feel any 1 or 2 questions which are important, we can.
No, I think Anand has dealt with all the aspects very clearly. Maybe if we have some session to follow, or while we are dealing with the different topics, it would be nice to expose the residents to some of the practical problems that they are likely to face when they are dealing with real life patients and real life isotope renograms assessment. So we'll move to the next session. Thank you.
Move to the next session on urodynamics. Faculties for this session are Dr. Sudipta Sen, Dr. Sujit Chaudhary, and Dr. Shripati. Dr. Sudipta Sen is Professor and Head of PSG Institute of Medical Sciences, Vellore. And Dr. Sujit Chaudhary, I already introduced. Dr. Shripati is Director of Pediatric Urology Fellowship Program, which is started first time, I think, in India by him. Is the Senior Consultant Pediatric Urologist and Robotic Surgeon. He's going to facilitate this session. So over to you, Dr. Shripati.
Thank you, Pradnya, and thank you for...
I have started late, but I think you can utilize your complete 45 minutes.
No problem. I think you need to enable me to do screen sharing. I'm having the same problem that Anand Alladi had. You need to enable screen sharing. Okay, so I was listening to the talk on renal transplant. This is for all the postgraduates. Please don't think that you can get away without knowing about urodynamics and say the same thing like what you would say about renal transplant. If you're going to practice pediatric urology, you jolly well have to know about urodynamics. And so we have put together a program which will enable you to do that. Each of us is going to take 12 minutes. I'm going to run you through the basics so that you will know what urodynamics is about and how to interpret it. And Sudipta will take you through very specific conditions. And Sujit will round it off by giving his massive experience of the use of urodynamics in a clinical setting, which also is extremely important for you to know. So without much ado, we will start off. So urodynamics in children, the basics, this is what we are going to talk about today. By definition, if somebody asks you what is urodynamics, it's the study of the pressure-volume relationships in the bladder. So in other words, you need to know how much water or how much urine can this bladder hold at what pressure. And this will give you an ability to actually to provide a pathophysiological explanation for the patient's complaints. When should you do urodynamics? And this is very, 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 very important. Both Sujit and Sudipta will agree with me. We get referrals from people saying, oh, the child has VUR, can you do a urodynamics? You must have a specific clinical question that you're trying to answer. When the results of the test will alter management, like you're going to put CIC, you're going to stop or change a drug. When you're planning any major surgical intervention, like a Mitrofanov or an augmentation cystoplasty, or when you are asked to evaluate the bladder prior to a transplant. So the preliminaries are, before you do urodynamic study, please make sure that you have all these investigations at hand. Nothing irritates me more than, than the referring clinicians say, everything is all right. When actually I need to see what this is like. I need an ultrasound KUB, a post-void estimate. I need to see the shape of the bladder, the outlet, the VUR, the dis synergy. Let me have a look at that before I decide what type of study to do and how to do it. It will be good to have a DMSA. It will be good if you are suspecting a dysfunctional voider, it's good to have a bladder diary. Now, why all this is important is when you prepare a report and you give a report, oftentimes it's sent back or you get a phone query saying, can you give us a management plan also? So before you give a management plan, all these are very important. I hope you're able to understand that now. So what age for urodynamics? Any age, even neonates, but generally we do it in older children who will cooperate. They'll be able to inform sensation and they will void on command. Otherwise, you'll get a small toddler who's crying constantly. Anesthesia is undesirable as it vitiates the study. So the types of urodynamic studies are basically non-invasive, which is Euroflow and Euroflow EMG, which are voiding phase studies. Invasive urodynamics is cystometrogram, which is a filling phase study, which is what we often do. A pressure flow study is where you do both filling and voiding phase. A video urodynamic study is where you do filling and voiding phase in the presence of VUR. And a provocative urodynamics is a special situation where you occlude the bladder neck and check whether the bladder is a compliant bladder or whether it's a rogue bladder. If you remember the APAPU meeting which Sujit hosted in Delhi, we spoke a lot about this with Stuart Bauer at that particular time. So what type of UDS do you choose? If the child is voiding normally, a Euroflow or a Euroflow EMG is more than enough. If you want to know what is happening during the filling phase, a cystometrogram is enough. If you want to know, is the bladder neck and the urethral sphincter competent, then you need to do a pressure flow study or a video urodynamics. If you want to know, does the bladder contract adequately during voiding and is voiding complete, you need to do pressure flow study or video urodynamics. If there is VUR, if you want to know when does it happen, you need to do video urodynamics. So basically, the type of study you do depends on what is the type of condition you are trying to find out. The bare essentials are you need a bladder catheter for the measurement of the vesical pressure. You need a rectal catheter which will subtract the abdominal pressure from the vesical pressure and give you a detrusor pressure. You need external transducers. You need a pump to fill the bladder at a predetermined rate. And you need a Euroflow machine to assess voiding. So you can use 2 feeding tubes, but we use these custom-made urodynamic catheters, which are double lumen catheters, and they're pretty good. Again, rectal catheters, I cannot emphasize the importance of rectal catheters. You can do a study without a rectal catheter, but having said that, it will not be absolutely, you want to publish the results of your urodynamic studies later on. You will find that generally you can't really get a very good opinion unless you put a rectal catheter which subtracts abdominal pressure. And this again, we use a custom catheter, but you can put any fluid filled balloon which is tied onto a feeding tube. And there is a specific way in which you prepare this rectal catheter, you take out all the air bubbles, you fill this, and then you measure the pressure through this particular channel here. So these are the external pressure transducers. There are different machines. This is one machine that we use. The single most important point as far as this we are not conducting a workshop, so I'm just taking the most important points and giving it to you. The external transducer should be at the level of the upper border, the symphysis pubis, and 0 centimeters of water is at this level. Thereafter, if you don't get this right, there will be an error in all subsequent measurements. So it's very important for you to do this. So this is the pump, which pumps it at a predetermined rate. You can, in occasions when the pump hasn't worked on us or has failed, after starting a study, we've used a syringe pump. And all the lines are connected and they are ready. We have a bladder catheter. This is the side arm that is measuring the bladder pressure. We have a rectal catheter, the side arm that is measuring the rectal pressure connected to the transducers, and you have the pump on the side, and we are having a laptop on which we are recording it, and everyone is wearing an apron, lead apron, because we're going to use the C-arm as well. So how do you do a bladder capacity calculation? Very important to know the standard formula, 30 into age plus 30. But if the child is less than 1 year of age, this is a good formula to follow, 38 plus age into months into 2.5. For those who are between 1 and 2 years, the Kiefer formula is quite good. Why is this important? Because you have to do slow filling at 5% of the expected bladder capacity for age. Lot of times fast filling because you want to finish the study quickly, you want to do something else. You will get a linear pressure rise which will mimic a poor compliance. You have to eliminate constipation, and a full rectum will not enable you to get a good rectal pressure measurement. This is one of the major problems with putting rectal catheters. So we'll come to the Uroflow. It's the simplest of urodynamic techniques, non-invasive, inexpensive, and it's often used to decide whether invasive urodynamics is warranted. If you can combine it with an ultrasound, then you can have a pediatric urology office suite, and that will be the most useful thing that you can do. Before, during, and after, you maintain a frequency volume chart for about 7 days. Ask the child to drink water and to cooperate with you by voiding on command. After voiding, measure the post-void residue by ultrasound. A modified bladder diary, especially if your dysfunctional voiding is an important part of your OP consultation, it's important that you ask them to maintain a bladder diary, which will give you an idea of the number of voids they do, the fluid intake, how many changes, how wet, when, leak, and the bowel frequency, a 2-week defecation diary. These 2 things the child will do, and they really enjoy doing it, they will do. However good or bad it is written, you will get a very good idea of how important the problems are. So a Uroflow trace, this is a Uroflow trace, it's a bell-shaped curve, and all that you need to do are just 3 things: the maximum flow rate, the volume of the void, and the shape of the curve. That's all you need to know. So I'm repeating it again: the maximum flow rate, the voided volume, and the shape of the curve. So what do we look for? A voided volume, maximum flow rate, shape of trace. We need at least 100 mils voided volume in order to be able to give a good interpretation. And depending on the shape of the curve, we can interpret and give various diagnosis based on the shape of the curve. Let me show you a few. The first is a bell-shaped curve with a normal peak flow and a completely silent perineal EMG. This is a normal void with no post-void residue. A female who's habituated to holding void urine in school comes home, has an explosive void. You get a tower curve. This is seen in those who have urgency. This is the sort of curve for whom you can put anticholinergics, because urgency is a very strong detrusor contraction. And that's a super detrusor contraction which has just enabled the bladder to empty very quickly. A plateau curve is one that happens in any obstructed bladder. It may either be the sphincter contracting, or it may be a post-hypospadias, or it may be a urethral stricture, a very prolonged void with a very low maximum flow rate. The child is voiding, but you see a dip in the Uroflow curve. This means that this is where the urethral sphincter is contracting to stop the urine flow. So these sort of dips which don't touch the base indicate to us that there is sphincter contraction which is interfering with the flow of urine, a sign of a dysfunctional voider. When you have curves that are like this, peaks which are with sort of in between intervals where the flow completely touches normal, the baseline, this is an interrupted or a fractionated voiding which is happening by Valsalva. When you add EMG electrodes to the perineum to find out what the pelvic floor is doing, it becomes a Uroflow EMG. And here you have an obstructive voiding, which is because of a very prominent sphincter contraction. And this is a classic dysfunctional voider. You can use it when you're doing a biofeedback training. Now, I just wanted to explain to you how to read a cystometrogram. You're going to have 2 talks now which are going to show you graphs. So you need to know how to read a cystometrogram. When you see a cystometrogram, you'll essentially get 1, 2, 3, 4 components to it. This is the PVES, the P abdomen. As I said, the P detrusor is a mathematical derivation when you take the P abdomen away from the P vest, and that is your P det, and this is what we are looking at. And the amount of water we have filled in the bladder will show as the volume of the infusate here. So you get 4 components. Remember, cystometrogram is a filling phase study, and it's the commonest study that we do. Let us say we make the child sit on a commode. We have all the lines fixed. We have a P vest, we have a P abdomen, we have a P det, and then we add a uroflow to it. When the bladder becomes full and the child says, I want to pass urine, we say, go ahead, you get a uroflow curve. And the volume of urine that the child has passed will come here. The volume that you have put into the bladder will be the volume of the infusate. In other words, from 4, this now becomes 6. P vest, P abdomen, P det, uroflow, volume of void, how much has been put in. So this is a pressure flow study. Now, a video urodynamics. When do you do video urodynamics? When you do video urodynamics and you do intermittent screening, the value is when you are noting, say there is left-sided reflux here, I want to know what the bladder pressure is at that particular time. The upper tracts are completely full on the left side. I need to know what the bladder pressure is. I can see right-sided reflux happening. What is the bladder pressure? When the whole system is full, what is the bladder pressure? So this is what video urodynamics is all about. Another aspect of video urodynamics, which is often neglected, where people don't really pay much attention to it, is you